Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the East Tennessee History Center. I'm the president and CEO of the East Tennessee Historical Society, granddaughter, and I just want to thank you all for coming in and participating in our talk today, our brown bag lecture, which we're really excited about. Before we get going, though, I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the upcoming programs that we have. Tomorrow, on February 28th, Humanities East Tennessee is hosting I guess kind of a workshop about growers and crafters and revolutionary ideals here in East Tennessee. That will be here all day. And then we also have, coming up the following weekend, we have our symposium on women in old-timey music, which is going to go from March 5th and 6th, really over the weekend, all the way through to Sunday. And you can learn more about that on our website, where we have a calendar that sort of walks you through the whole symposium. It'll be here at the Bijou, and it's going to be a whole lot of fun. And then our next big talk, which will be March 18th, which feels like a way ways, but it isn't that far away, will be Land, Language, and Women, Cherokee and American Educational History by Julie Reed. So that's March 18th, and that'll be in the evening. It won't be a brown bag lecture as well. So let me just tell you a little bit about our speakers. Kathyrn Turner worked in HR for newspapers across 10 states. It is actually, I think, the granddaughter of the subject of the talk today, which is really fascinating. And then with her, and co-author, is Leon Alligood, who is a professor emeritus of journalism at Middle Tennessee State University, and was previously a journalist himself and a reporter who covered rural Middle Tennessee and had a career spanning 2 decades. So he's done a lot. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn over to our speakers so we can hear about your book, which is, by the way, with the University of Tennessee Press. It's there in the back. So I'm just giving a shout out. Okay, without further ado.
Thank you, Ward, so much. We're so happy to be here. As I understand it, a lot of these things usually happen on Wednesdays. And we appreciate the fact that you've switched your schedule around so you could join us. We're always happy to show up and talk about this story that's so close to our hearts. The story of my grandfather, a bank manager who left his Saltillo, Tennessee home in 1931, is a complicated one.
95 years ago, in the winter of 1931, Boss Bingham learned an auditor had been dispatched from the state to audit the bank. There was a shortage. When Boss learned this, he set into motion a complicated and obviously illegal plan that allowed him to escape judicial action into the bank's impending insolvency, while also protecting numerous family members and friends who helped to pay his debt.
On a snowy night in January 1931, I lost my place.
That's what I'm here for.
Boss, my grandfather, his younger brother Howard, and an unknown number of men from the community did the unthinkable. Under a cloak of darkness, they entered Shady Grove Cemetery and dug up the body of a 70-year-old man who had died 3 weeks earlier. They placed the body in Boss's Chevy coupe, drove it about 50 miles north towards Jackson, Tennessee, and set it ablaze. The borrowed cadaver was repeatedly set on fire until much of the body had been consumed.
At dawn the next morning, a 16-year-old boy who was out inspecting his rabbit traps discovered the burning car. The Madison County Sheriff was alerted, so was the coroner, By the end of the day, 5 Saltillo men had identified the charred remains inside the car as their longtime friend, fellow Mason, and their banker, Boss Bingham.
2 days later, the body identified as Lionel Boss Bingham was buried in Shady Grove Cemetery. Meanwhile, very much alive Boss Bingham was on his way west, where he adopted a new name, Marvin Lester Brooks, and where eventually he married another woman and fathered another family. When I decided to retire in 2014 to focus on writing Boss Brooks, I knew this was too big a project for just me. It was going to require a tremendous amount of research and investigative effort. After all, at that point, the story was over 80 years old, and there had been a shroud of silence around this story in that town for decades. Gathering information would not be easy. I knew I did not want it to be told as a salacious crime story only. Although, make no mistake, there are lots of crimes involved in this story. But I wanted it to be told with dignity and respect. There's so many other layers to this story, so much humanity, stories to be told within it. So I knew I needed to partner with a great storyteller. As he mentioned, I worked in the newspaper business for 38 years, and I was not a journalist, but I certainly got to know and get to know the work of a lot of journalists that came through the doors at the National Banner and the Tennessean for years. As I thought about who would be perfect to collaborate with me on this, Leon's name came way up to the top of the list. I had read his stories over the years. He was a great human interest writer. And I could hear the reader reaction that his stories would get. And I liked the way he treated the subjects in the story. I just think he's a man of integrity, and I think that's what I needed in a partner. So I reached out to Leon in late 2013, and I'll let you.
I want to point out that I have never been to the Human Resources Office before, okay? I was not a problem child at Tennessee. Okay? When Kathy called me up in 2013 and said, I've got this family history that I want to work on in my retirement, and I need some help with it. And she said, I would like to sit down with you, tell you this story, and see if you would like to collaborate with me. At the mention of family history, my eyes sort of rolled back in my head because I didn't want to get involved in anybody's family history. But a reporter is never going to give up free meal. So I went and had lunch with her, and she told me the story, and 1 hour led into 2, and I think we were probably there for 3 hours. And I was smitten with the story of all things Boss Brooks that day, and I continue to be smitten with that story today. It has been a long journey to research and write the story, and it was a long quest to find a publisher who believed in this tale as much as we believed in it. But finally, we got UT Press to say yes. And Kathy heard me shout all the way from Lebanon to Franklin when I got Thomas Wells' note saying, we want to take this up and champion the story. So it's been a good fit for us, and we're delighted that UT Press took us on.
I learned the true story of my grandfather's death in 1975. My father called me to his home in Missouri to break this news to me. It was quite shocking, as you can imagine. And he also told me, we've really couldn't talk about it except for the immediate family, because at that time they were concerned there might still be legal actions that some folks were liable for. So I only talked about it with the immediate family at that point, but, you know, as fascinating as I thought it was, I was in college at the time, and I had a lot of life going on. You know, after college, I got married and then started a career and then had a son. And while that story always fascinated me and it was never out of my mind, but it kind of went on the back burner for all those years. And as I kind of entered my 50s, I guess as we get older, we start to think about our family history more. And my interest in it grew, my curiosity grew, so I began to research in earnest. And yeah, then what did I do? My original thought actually was my project would be to document the story for my family's history. It was so incomplete. I just really felt like it needed to be documented so families after us would know what happened. But the more I researched, the more I knew that it was a bigger story than that. It didn't just impact my family, although it certainly did a lot. In fact, it changed the trajectory of some of my family members' lives. But I began to understand that the impact of that story went beyond our family and into the town of Saltillo, and in fact, Hardin County. Because of what happened in 1931, so many things were put into motion. The bank closed the next day, never to reopen. It was during the Depression. Some of the folks who had loans outstanding with the bank were not able to repay those loans. And some folks lost their homes, some folks lost their farms. And the people in that area generally, if you grew up there, you stayed there. So the impact of all of that just reverberated over the generations of people that were from that area. So I knew it was big and important, and that it really needed to be publicly told. So that's kind of how that came to be.
So that night in the cemetery was the beginning of what we call in the book the lie. A cloak of secrecy sort of settled over Saltillo, a very small town, and for the remainder of their lives, Boss's friends who participated in his escape from Saltillo, from Tennessee, and the troubles there. And these were otherwise law-abiding men, but they never talked about the events of that January 1931. Time after time after time, Kathy and I would find descendants of her grandfather's contemporaries in Saltillo, and we would ask about the Boss story. And they would smile and they'd say, I've heard of it, but I don't know anything about it because my parents never told me anything about it, and their parents never told them anything about it. It was just, it was truly amazing that for more than 4 decades, the people of this town kept a secret. Nobody talked about what happened to Boss Brooks. Uncovering the details of a 95-year-old family history is problematic in so many different ways. The main thing is that the characters that you would want to talk to are all dead and gone. Many of them were buried at Shady Grove Cemetery. Here are some of the characters in the story. In the bottom left, you have Kathy's grandmother, her aunt in the picture on top of that outside the parking lot in Nashville, The picture on the far right is Verna, who was Boss's conduit of information when he went to Texas. She's the one that all the letters were funneled through to her home in Memphis. And then in the center, that's Boss and his Texas wife, circa 1964, 65, something like that. There was also the issue of reconciling information from various sources who contradicted each other, or sometimes their stories were just slightly off. They weren't saying the same thing. For instance, who went to the cemetery on the night to dig up the body? Well, from the Texas daughters, we heard that it was a doctor, a lawyer, and a content owner. And then we've heard other people say it was 3 content owners. And then Boss's brother said it was 3 lawyers who went to do the digging up. So we don't know who was there that cold January night, but we know that somebody was there, likely all men who knew Boss very well, and they dug up the body. Letters played an important role in the Boss Brooks story. For a few years after Brooks moved to Texas, he still corresponded with his wife back in Tennessee, but as I say, he used Verna in Memphis to transfer those letters from Texas to Tennessee and Tennessee to Texas. Unfortunately, we do not know what was in those letters, what was said. All those letters were felonies had been committed, so nobody wanted to be caught with evidence that they knew that Boss was alive because they knew the charges were going to be forthcoming. So we don't know what those letters said. We can only speculate, but they were probably burned up in evening fires, if we had to guess. Boss Bingham had to remain dead. If Boss happened to become alive again, the house of cards that had been built was going to fall down very quickly, and a lot of people were going to be going to jail, not just Boss. Bingham's relatives in Tennessee did reveal some details. For instance, Mary's letter to Boss she asked him to come home from Texas because she was being hounded by insurance investigators. We'll get into insurance in a moment. And she wanted him to come home, and he wrote back that I can't come home because if I come home, more families than ours will be punished. Fathers will go to jail. Jail doors will be slammed, and lives will be interrupted. And I just can't have that on my conscience. And so then she wrote back and said, offered him a homemade divorce decree and said, well, you live your life, and I'll live mine. And they never saw each other ever again from the night he stepped off his house in Saltillo. They never saw each other again. I'll let Kathy tell you about some letters that did survive.
Yes, some letters from Texas to Tennessee and vice versa did survive. These are the letters of Brooks' daughters, Bobby and Sue. And they wrote them to their Tennessee half-siblings after the 2 sides of the family were united. We were so fortunate that Brooks' Texas children were open to sharing information with us. Leon and I went to Texas in 2015 to meet all 4 children. We interviewed them all, and they were one was a little reluctant. We kind of won him over. The daughters especially were excited to share information about family life that they had led with my grandfather, and also anxious to find out about their siblings in Tennessee and how they grew up. While we were there, they toured us around. They took us to Spring Creek, which was where my grandfather initially camped for a couple of years. He had tuberculosis, so going out west was a good thing for him in that respect. So he gained some of his strength back and worked on that ranch for a couple of years. The biggest debt of gratitude that we owe to Bobby and Sue is that if they had not tracked us down after my grandfather's death to reach out to find my family, we would have never known that he didn't die in 1931. My dad would never have known, my aunts would never have known. My grandmother had passed away by that point. But their acceptance of us and their actually welcoming to us was such a gift. In fact, my father became very close to the two daughters, Bobby and Sue. And I still maintain a relationship with Bobby myself. So, there are some silver linings in some of these stories because we came out with some relationships that we value that we wouldn't. It's ironic, this later generation recognized the need to save documents so their family history could survive, just as the previous generation destroyed documents as a means of self-preservation. There were a series of letters that went back and forth between my dad, my aunts, and Bobby and Sue, and my Uncle Howard, who's known as Jigs in the book, my grandfather's brother. And these letters were so emotional at times. They were sometimes, in later years, as they had known each other for a while, they were very much like letters you write to anybody else in your family. What your kids are doing, and who just graduated, and all that. But the initial letters were really filled with a lot of emotion, and having an insight into those letters really helped us a lot with the story.
So insurance played a big role in the Bossberg story. So there were felonies that did occur, as the title implies. One of the most important aspects of the story focuses on the first week of May 1932, the insurance trials. So during the years that Boss was head cashier at Hardin County Bank, he purchased life insurance policies on himself from companies as far away as Kansas City, Chicago, California, and they were all the beneficiaries were either his wife or his children. He had $37,500 worth of insurance on him when the day he disappeared in 1931. That's equal to about $800,000 today in today's economy. On the morning the burned corpse was found in Boss's car, a letter written by Boss the previous afternoon was delivered to the bank's board of directors. The letter, handwritten by Boss on a notepad given out by Agricultural Products Company as a promotional item, became one of the most important exhibits in the trial. This is from the transcript of the trial. Unfortunately, we do not have that farm implement notebook that he actually wrote it in, because it was, when the trials went to the appellate courts, all those exhibits went with them. And saddest day of my life, one of the saddest things about this is when I called up in Jackson, called up the appellate courts and said, do you have do you have records of the 1931 case, and do you have the exhibits? And they said, no, we burned those. So we know what was in the letter, we just don't have his handwritten letter. And we have looked, we have scoured the State Library archives just in case it returned somehow back to the Supreme Court, but we never did. What's interesting about this letter is how truthful it is. He says, "Now I don't know what I will do or where I will go, as I've been crazy for 3 months, knowing that the time was soon to come, and if anything should happen to me, and when do they find his body? The next day. All that I have is for the depositors of the bank and stockholders. I have insurance in the amount of $37,500, most made to estate and the like, but if anything should happen to me, all of it is for the benefit of the people who have money in the bank, as I do hate for anyone to lose on my account." So, obviously, when the insurance companies read this letter, and her grandmother realizing, wait a minute, I don't have any income coming in now. I've got to find a way to feed 3 kids. I've got to find a way to keep a house and a roof. So her grandmother, who probably had, we don't even know if she'd ever been to the Hardin County Courthouse before and stepped inside, but she sued the insurance companies. How she found a lawyer from Memphis, we don't know. Probably Verna maybe helped out in that regard. But anyway, she sued the insurance companies. Bankers Credit Life Insurance Company was one, Inter-Southern Life Insurance Company was another, and all of these cases came to trial in Hardin County Chancery Court. So the banks weren't going to pay. Her grandmother sued, and because the bank wanted to make sure that they got their cut of any insurance proceeds that went to her grandmother, they joined in the lawsuit. So there were three entities in the lawsuit versus the insurance companies. One was her grandmother, one was the Hardin County Bank, and one was the State Department of Banking and Insurance. So they were all keeping tabs on one another. So her grandmother was going to get a share, and then they were going to slice up the rest of the money somehow in another suit that would follow this main suit to determine whether or not the insurance company should pay. So one of the lawyers for the defunct Hardin County Bank was Elijah W. Ross, or Lige, as he was called. It turned out the legal field was something of a family business. For several generations prior to Lige, there were lawyers, and since then there have been lawyers, a couple of generations of lawyers, including one John Ross, who was still a lawyer in Savannah. He was the grandson of E.W. Ross. So we placed a call to, when I decided to join with Kathy on this, we placed a call to John to see if he had ever heard of the Boss Bingham case and the insurance trials. And we called him on the phone, and I'm sure a big smile came on his face when he heard the word boss, because he was very familiar with the case. His grandfather had told him about the case when he was much younger. And so John said, why don't you come over to the office and I'll show you what I got. And when we arrived at this office, this is what we found: a safe that was full of Boss Bingham stuff, saved for the years, for posterity. Yes, the papers were yellowed, but it was all there. These letters really gave us an inside baseball look at how these trials and how the whole Boss situation was being handled in Saltillo. The only point of law that was in effect in the trials about insurance was, is Boss dead? If Boss is dead, insurance guys, you got to pay up. And so the insurance companies could not prove that Boss was alive, though they tried. And as a result, all of these insurance companies had to pay up. Now, two of them, Woodman of the World and Businessman's Associates of Chicago, Businessman's Assurance Company of Chicago, they had they had to go, they eventually went to the state Supreme Court. And the state Supreme Court said, the man's dead. I think, there's proof enough that he's dead. And so you're going to have to pay up. And so at that point, then it became a different kind of trial. It became the state Department of Banking plus Hardin County Bank against her grandmother. And so they went at it, and they got within 2 days of trial. And they were bouncing numbers back and forth as to how they were going to divide the money. And finally they came to a decision, and her grandmother got $6,900, something like that, to live on. Now, originally there was $37,000, but that got reduced because a couple of the insurance companies, they were not supposed to be selling insurance in Tennessee, so those policies were void. So there were all kinds of documents in there, and the lawyers in these files, and the lawyers were sick and tired of Boss and this lawsuit. And one of them, this is from John Ross to Mr. Key, who was one of the lawyers for one of the insurance companies. And John writes, we loved this when we found it, but it was really interesting. He said, no one will be more delighted than I at the conclusion of this matter after having prepared some 10 or more briefs in the case, and have been worried, annoyed, harassed, vexed, and cussed about it, with probably less than half my interest in that of anybody else connected with the case. I want to meet you there in the matter finally and eternally. So he was ready to get rid of Boss. I'm surprised he didn't take all of those documents and just get rid of them. But apparently, Lige saved everything from his cases, and so does John Ross. If you go into his law office, there were also documents. So once the bank, the insurance question was taken care of, came down to the question of how much is the bank going to get, and also came down to the bank's insolvent, it's closed, so now you've got to balance the books, and if you owe the bank money, or if you've got a mortgage, you're going to have to pay up, or you're going to be foreclosed on. And so we found numerous letters like this. This is letters of friends of a man who were writing on his behalf. He did not know that they were writing on his behalf, but pleading with John Ross to please do not do hereby honestly and fairly and kindly ask you, worthy gentlemen, to consider the times, depression, and hardships before selling Mr. Edwards' property. So his property was being foreclosed on and was going to be taken away from him. And those were, for both of us, those were they hit us here because we knew that Boss had put off foreclosing. Boss was not a good banker. He just didn't have the heart for it. It couldn't be hard with people, especially in depression. All right, Kathyrn.
In addition to documents from the insurance trials and other court proceedings related to the failure of the bank, we depended heavily on other databases. Census data was used to find descendants of Boss's friends and neighbors in Saltillo, and websites like Find a Grave proved valuable in finding families too. I don't know if any of you ever used Find a Grave. It's amazing what keeps happening. Although there was no comprehensive reporting of Boss's death or the insurance trials, we were surprised to find newspaper coverage in places as far away as Ohio, and in most daily newspapers in Tennessee, and in several surrounding states. Considering the number of court proceedings that took place due to the bank's failure, we took care to choose quotes, facts, and anecdotes that were offered as testimony. Here are two examples. A farmer named Arch White owed the bank $108.56 and was forced to sell his beloved mules and his Weber farm wagon, advertised in his day as the king of all farm wagons. But he negotiated with the bank to stall the sale so he could grow another crop of cotton. His hope was to raise all or a portion of what was owed. We write, how bittersweet that job must have been for White, working in the searing heat of the Tennessee summer, knowing all the while that every bead of sweat on his brow would not yield money in his pocket. Boss's parents, James and Josie Bingham, my great-grandparents, were among those sued by the bank for failure to pay their mortgage. They contended that Boss had marked the loan paid, but the auditor's report proved otherwise. On the stand, my great-grandfather became frustrated when asked about the auditor's findings as found in Chapter 18. I do not know why a lot of things was done that is done. A lot of things was done that was not done by the Binghams that they were accused of, he said. While this statement lacked the polish of a good speaker, his message was received clearly by me. He didn't believe his son was either a crook or a poor accountant. He believed that Boss did his best to keep the bank solvent. My great-grandfather was never privy to the lie. He died 6 years later in 1940, never knowing his oldest son was alive in Texas. Finally, we come to my grandmother's testimony in the insurance trials. Without those yellowing court transcripts in the safe at John Ross's law office in Savannah, I might not have learned of my grandmother's testimony and never felt its impact. She was the first witness to be called in the first trial in May 1932. Here's how we describe the scene in the book. She is answering questions from her attorney, Grover McCormick. Where is Mr. Bingham now? Mr. Bingham, dead. McCormick, I didn't hear you. Mrs. Bingham, he is dead. And with that admission, under oath, found on page 3 of the trial transcript, my grandmother crossed the line from which she could not retreat. By stating that her husband was dead and she knew he was alive, the lie became her lifelong companion. During the week of the trials, my grandmother was asked whether her husband was dead or alive in various ways, nearly 4 dozen times. Each time, she replied that Boss was dead.
Okay, let's take a moment here. Let's answer some questions. Hopefully you have some. And we'll try to answer them. Anybody? Yes.
You said a lot of people kept lies. Was it more than family that kept lies? Because I tell you, if I lost the farm because of this guy who wants to shirk all responsibility and take off for the hills, you know, I'm gonna go tracking him down. You know, who all was involved with this lie?
Well, we don't know for sure. There are some folks in South Hill that think they know for sure, but we do know that they were a great influence in that town. Whether they were lawyers or cotton gin owners, whatever they were, they held a lot of sway with people, and I think there was a lot of fear instilled in folks in that town to talk about it.
Fear. So oh, interesting. Interesting.
Yes, back in the back.
Wouldn't his death be considered a suicide? And why does an insurance company have to pay for a suicide?
That's a great question. And back then, you could buy policies that covered suicide. He did have one policy that did cover suicide, and I think he would have paid $15,000 if it was a suicide. Obviously, we don't do that anymore these days. Obviously, we think that the insurance, well, going back to your question, we think that Boss, as I said earlier, just did not have a stomach for banking. his friends and his family, the people that he saw every day, were hurting because of the depression. And so if you read the book, you get to the chapter on the audit, and you find that people would come in and cash a check for $20, and he would give them the money, but he would hold that back from putting that on the ledger so it wouldn't come out of that person's account. And so just about all of the 200 depositors in the bank were overdrawn at some point. I think the lowest was 2 cents, and the highest was 9,000 and something, and that was bosses. And so what we think happened is that a lot of the overdrawn stuff, the stuff that the auditor couldn't make sense of and had to apply it to somebody, he applied it to the boss. And so there was some in some of the testimony in the trial, it alludes in that. It doesn't quite. We both of us wanted the lawyer to ask a couple more questions about that to get some clarity so that we can know. But anyway, boss, he just didn't have the stomach for it. And as a result, he knew what was coming. This plan to vacate Saltillo had been in the works for some time. You remember in his note, he said, for the past 3 months now, we think that at some point he started worrying about how this was all going to look and who was going to be in trouble, and he had TB and he needed to go out west. So I think he had some folks who mentioned to him that, well, if you go out west, we'll help you get away. You can establish a new life out there. Your family can join you at another time, and everything will be okay. But that just didn't happen. Yeah.
What was that for his friends? I mean, did they just do it out of friendship? It seems like that's a big risk to take for just.
One of the kind of root issues was that the bank was in trouble in a good part because there had been some under-the-table loans given for cotton futures. The price of cotton plummeted. They couldn't repay the loans. Some people think these people who had these loans were the same people who inspired to get him out, because they knew the time was coming, the audit was going to show a lot of things.
Yes.
So the wife in Texas knew about the family in Tennessee?
She and his family knew that he had left the family behind. But he never told them where or their names. He had saved some pictures of the children and taken them with him. And the 2 daughters, Bobby and Sue, would take those pictures out of the drawer and look at them and wonder, about that. I think their curiosity to find the second family kind of started with seeing those pictures.
2 questions. Was there anything besides that paragraph in that note that caused or started the ball rolling as to whether or not he was actually dead? Was there anything besides that note that caused people to question whether or not he was dead? And also, what about the family of the man who was dug up and burned?
That was Mr. J.C. Lucas. Actually, his grave was, 20 feet away
25 steps away from
where they buried my grandfather. Well, his headstone wasn't there. So as we were working on this, I got to thinking about Mr. Lucas and his family, and they had no idea at that point what had happened to him. So I really felt like I needed to try to track some of their family down and let them know what happened to their relative. And through Find a Grave and other things, I found a great-granddaughter who lived in West Memphis, Arkansas. And so I called her, and as gently as I could, told her what had happened to her, what had happened to his body. not knowing what she was gonna say in response, I was really worried and concerned about what that reaction might be. I mean, I can only imagine what mine would be. But she was this very genteel, gracious Southern lady. And she said, after I got done with telling her what had happened, she said, well, that is amazing, but how do you know? How do you know this? So I went through the facts that we had gathered, and while I'm holding my breath, she says, well, you know, he's dead and gone, and those bones are bones. I don't think we need to do anything about this. So that was very gracious on her part.
So, did they know that the body was missing? No, they
No.
didn't, right? They filled the grave back in, so nobody knew that body was missing. And so when they identified it at the car being burned, they really thought that it was Bingham.
In fact,
It's not exactly tell George Bailey, but as y'all looked into it, it does have a lot of ethical nuances. Where do y'all kind of come down on the totality of this? I mean, it was not just him, it was community leaders and others. It was a very, very strange thing.
Well, I'll say a couple words and I'll let you finish. All through this research that we've been doing, I really had to suspend my judgment about, I had heard he was a fine man, I heard he was a crook, all of these stories involved around him. I was desperate to know what kind of man he was. In my heart, I wanted to find out, well, he was a really good person. Everybody else was fine, but, you know, I really had to suspend that thinking, because what we really wanted was the truth. So it was not easy sometimes, but what we came up with in the very end, I'll let you describe.
He was also a complicated man, you know, and he wanted to do the right thing. And yes, he had gotten into giving these under the table loans because this was the practice that his predecessor, Robert Hinkle, who was the head cashier before Boss took over, that's what he was doing too. And as a result, Boss just began to weigh on him and what was happening in the Depression, and he could see all the hurt, you know, and he knew that people were had gotten down to a dime a pound, whereas in the early 1920s it was up to 35 cents a pound. You can make a living on 35 cents. You can't buy bread at 10 cents, you know, you can't pay the mortgage at 10 cents. So he was just, Sue, his oldest daughter, she went to business school after high school, and she told her dad that she wanted to go into the banking business. He said, no, honey, I don't want you to do that. You're just like me. You don't have you can't be hard enough of an individual to be that kind of person that a banker needs to be. To foreclose on people, to do all the things that bankers do when you can't meet the demands of a note or whatever. And so I think that he tried to do his best in Texas with a new start. He went to church in Tennessee. He never went to church in Texas. We only know he went to church in Texas 3 times for weddings of his kids, and maybe a baptism or 2. But he was well respected in Texas. He was elected county commissioner for 3 consecutive terms. Everybody called him Brooks. He was early on. He remembered telling his Texas daughters that he had written a check and he signed it Boss Brooks. And all he did was call the bank's vice president and said, Charlie, whatever his name was, I'm sorry, I don't know what I'm saying about that. I signed another man's name on my check. Would you just pass it through? He said, sure. So, yeah.
What happened to his wife in Tennessee?
My grandmother lived the rest of her life She, never had another man in her life.
Oh,
I think she was such a strong spiritual person. I think she considered herself still married. My brother asked her one time, Grandmother, why did you not ever remarry? And she said, I never met another man who was as good as he was.
oh.
Yeah, Warren?
I sort of have two questions in a statement, and I'll do it backwards. I love the stories, also sort of the story of methodology, how you came to the documents, what documents you could use, what you couldn't use, the fact you had to rely on find it right. I think that's really compelling. And I wonder if you thought about this like options as a movie, because this sounds almost cinematic to me.
We heard that so many times.
Who do you want to be boss? Who do you want to play Mary?
My husband's already picked out his role.
And seriously, you should see getting this option. I mean,
We have talked to one person about in California, and we thought when we started working on this, we thought this is a home run. We're going to knock this out of the park in 6 months and have a multi-$1,000 contract, and we're going to go on to make a movie out of it. And we worked on it for 12 years before we finished. And so, yeah, we would love for it to go that way, but I wanted to find the same good home in Hollywood that is found in Knoxville.
Yeah.
With UC Press.
Back to my other question, was there anything besides that paragraph that he wrote that caused the insurance companies and other people to question whether or not he was actually dead?
I think it was just the total circumstances of the whole thing, the state of the bank, and you can fill in.
Well, plus two, Mr. Lucas was 70 years old, and he was a good bit shorter than Boss. And Boss was 35 years old, and and I don't know. It just, of course, there was no DNA. There's no teeth examination. Nothing. No blood analysis. None of that stuff that you see on TV. They just had 5 men. This is interesting too. So Boss, about 8:30, South Hill learns through the community phone exchange that Boss's car had been found and a body is inside. And within an hour, 5 men from South Hill are on their way to Jackson to go to the funeral home / coroner to view the body. And based on those 5 men's identification, this body, there were no legs from the knee down, there were no arms from the elbow down. The face was completely, down to bone. And they looked at that, what was left of that human being, and they said, yeah, that's false. And the undertaker coroner believed him. He wrote on the death certificate, burned up in a car. And that gave Boss the chance to get away.
Some folks that think that the men who rushed over there to quickly identify that body were part of the scheme. Also, some people think they drove the car far enough towards Jackson that so it became a different county and a different coroner and a different funeral director who would know less about what Boss would have looked like.
Plus, and there's a Mason connection here too. Okay, so we think that, Kathy was at the cemetery one day putting flowers on one of her relatives' graves, and the woman came over to talk to her and found out about the book. And she said, oh, I know who did it. The Masons did it, But you go to South Hill and ask, it was either the men of the Baptist church, or it was the people who did banking, or it was the Masons, or it was the contingent owners, or it was the, whatever, you know. We don't know, we never will know. I don't know. I would love to know, yeah.
Did Mary's children know or suspect that their father was alive in Texas?
Never.
She really kept that a sealed
She took that
secret.
secret to her grave, but
Oh.
they never knew.
And they thought their daddy died in that car.
My aunt Mary Lou, who was older, my dad was only 2 when it happened. He doesn't remember his father, but my aunt Mary Lou was 6 at the time. She adored her father and followed him around on the farm. She talks about riding around on his shoulders. When she found out, my dad accepted it. It was a shock and it was hurtful and all that. But he didn't react as strongly as my aunt, who really felt like he had abandoned her and was very bitter for a long time.
Do you think your grandmother was a willing participant or just kind of forced into it?
I think she was forced into it. I don't know that she felt like she had any choice. Except there was.
Yes.
I've been sitting here for about an hour, and I'm telling you, my emotions are just up and down about this man, and I don't even know, I didn't know him. He's not my kin. I just wonder how you've dealt with all of that. And were there people that you approached that weren't as gracious as the woman whose husband was buried?
As we did interviews in Saltillo, there were a couple of folks that really were against, and a few relatives were against it as well. But some of the townspeople, we had an interview with, his name was Roger Cathy, and he had agreed to be interviewed, and we went to his house and we started talking and asking questions, and all of a sudden he goes, "Why do you want to bring all this stuff up now?
yeah.
These people have families that still live here." They thought it was a disrespectful thing for us to be doing. So there were opinions all across the board, but
So Mary's left with these young children, and she's a young woman herself. Did she ever work, get a job? How did she
she
support
worked on the farm for some number of years, kept it going.
her own farm?
Yeah, on the farm that they had. And then she had other people who helped out on the farm, but eventually she left the home place and she spent most of the rest of her life either living at my Aunt Mary Lou's house, helping her take care of her children, or going to my dad's house in Missouri and living there. She only in the very last years of her life did my dad build her a little tiny apartment of her own. He owned a big apartment building, but he carved out one especially for her. That was probably the first time in a long time she had her own space.
It's ironic that the one person who couldn't keep the secret was Boss himself. He's the one who, when he had a stroke in 1972, told one of his daughters, who was spending the night in the hospital with him, "Get a pad and pencil, because I want to tell you the story. You've been looking for the wrong family. My name is Bingham, not Brooks." And so the kids, the 2 daughters, had been calling all over the southeastern United States looking for a man named Jiggs Brooks. Jiggs was Boss's brother, and they were just looking for the wrong name. So they looked for Bingham, and they called Jiggs at his house in Tennessee, in Nashville, and had him within 30 minutes of trying to get through to find the guy. Mark.
I was just gonna make an observation. I come from a family of bankers in a small town. One of the things that's interesting to me is the fact that you mentioned that there were 200 depositors. Think about what banks are now, how impersonal they are, how consolidated that industry is, and then think about a bank that's built on the number of people in a small church, basically. How much different those relationships must have been. How you knew everybody that sat across the desk for you. You knew their parents and grandparents. you knew their trials and tribulations, you knew everything about them. The banking industry has just changed so much that it's hard for us 21st century people sometimes to even imagine the pressures that were on a banker during the Depression,
Right.
especially one with probably a really good heart, who was just trying to do the best he could under, the worst circumstances possible. And then the other thing I want to ask you is, it occurs to me, and you mentioned this a little bit, that this scenario couldn't happen today. There's too much technology. I was thinking about, you talked about movies. This would be 3 episodes of Dateline, It would be. And everybody would know about this story and would have an opinion about it. And there would be an army of bloggers doing the research that you guys are doing now to try to figure it out. It's just such a 20th century sort of scenario that couldn't repeat.
Yeah, when Boss moved to Texas in 1931, in the spring of 1931, they didn't hand out, Texas did not put photos on their driver's licenses for another 15 or so years. Social Security cards didn't come out for another 5 years. Boss established his identity in Texas by going to register to vote. And he entered, I guess they would have a voting drive, and he entered the courthouse, and there was a guy there, and he was, cutting up, and he said, "Hey there, young man, you look like you're about 30. He said, "Exactly right." So he had 5 years knocked off of his life. So his wife found out that her husband was actually 5 years older than he really was. And anyway, so it came back to her because when he applied, he had to wait 5 extra years to get Social Security.
But his wife never questioned him about where are your parents, where are your siblings, where are you from, where did you go to school? She didn't have a curiosity about.
Not that I don't know about this. I've never said it.
Bobby and Sue never mentioned anything about that. We just know that Boss held back from telling her what he had told his daughters until they got home, because he was afraid she was going to vanish and leave him in the hospital. And so but apparently she loved him enough to stick around with him and to keep him. Boss, one of the saddest things is that Boss, when he had his first stroke, he became paranoid. And when a car would pull up in the driveway, he would look to see who it was, and if he didn't recognize him, he would go out the back door. Because he was afraid somebody was coming. He was afraid his friends were coming to get him. What we don't know is, were they friends from Texas, or were they friends from Tennessee that were coming to get him?
I mean, just so, all the other people who suffered, he suffered too. He suffered from.
He did. They're suffering all around. Some came later than others, but that's part of when we was working on the title of this book. The original title was Boss Books, A True Story of Fraud in Families from Tennessee to Texas. And it just didn't capture it all for me because there's so much forgiveness in this story. So I asked our friends at UT Press, could we add forgiveness at the end of that title? And they said, yes, we can. We think that makes it better.
I like the rule of 3 too. Any other questions? Yes.
It sounds like the bank was able or tried to go back and get loans that people owed. What about, didn't some of those people have savings accounts that they weren't going to get their money out of, but yet the bank could go back and attempt to get?
Yeah, the payoff from the insurance funds was somewhere around 10 cents on the dollar. So
But I mean, they would lose their savings, but yet then the bank could still make them sell their property or repay loans.
Yes.
That's how bank works.
Right, many of them probably didn't have
During the
savings.
Depression and
That's what I meant,
they
maybe.
might not have had savings.
The biggest depositor had $6,000, And, it was not there anymore. And, you know, Boss, and I want to point out, Boss was never adjudicated in court that he was an embezzler, that he was skimming anything. It was, you know, that was never brought because he was dead.
He was dead, yeah.
My uncle had a gas station in Alabama in the Depression. And after the Depression, he had a book for all the people who owed him money that he let them have gas and automotive supplies, and they never paid him. But that's what you did in the community in the Depression.
Right. One more question, I think we'll have to call it quits.
I think you had a couple that we didn't.
Oh, it was a real great question about, if there was any other forensic evidence beyond the note and the fact that you sort of answered it, the 5 people identified, but there was no sort of forensic investigation.
And we've often wondered, well, when she called the Lucas family, are they going to have to come back here and get a DA to sign off to exhume the body, and then pay for somebody to examine it and do DNA testing if there's any DNA left? And what do we do? So, and now, what do we do now? Because there's a grave with L.B. Bingham on it, but it's not L.B. Bingham in the ground. L.B. Bingham is not, or Marvin Lester Brooks is out in Texas, in the Sherwood Cemetery. So, I don't know. There'll always be an asterisk by that tombstone. You know, this is not him. Yes.
What did you do for a living all the time you were in Texas?
Rancher, cotton farmer. And they lived in a very arid part of Texas and got very little rain. And they you had water rights. So you would pump in water into your fields. You got so many hours at a time. And one of them, and, you know, when Sue talks about that, because she farmed alongside him, and they talk about that night, spending nights out by the creek, pumping in the water, and he would sing a hymn. And his favorite hymn was the Old Rugged Cross. And I remember when Sue told us that, and she was crying, Sue was crying, and I turned over to Kathy, and Kathy was crying too because the Old Rugged Cross was her grandmother's favorite hymn.
I had a question with regards to, you said there's always gonna be an asterisk beside those headstones. So I guess that this comes up as like, well, there's really not an asterisk beside those headstones, only in your mind, right? Or have you gone on the fine grade to make notes?
On the fine grade, you'll see both headstones.
But are there asterisks in notes that says there's
No,
no body here, or this is not the right body?
There's no easy explaining this. That's the problem.
Link to the book.
That's what we have to do. You know, the elevator pitch for this story is a real booger. I mean, you just can't start. You get into it, and 30 minutes later, you're still talking about balls. You know, and it was. I've had the most fun of my career chasing the story. I hope it does get some traction, and it already has. We're doing pretty well, but we're trying to break into Texas. Because Tennessee knew about the story. Texas, it's wide open. They don't know about Boston out there. You know, they don't know that the Langston County Commissioner, who was not Marvin Lester Brooks, he was actually Lila Boss Bingham. Yes.
Why did they call him Boss? Was that his just original name?
That was his given name. The census told us that. In the census, they wrote his name as Lionel Boss Bingham in more than 1 year. So we can see that was his real name.
He was never known by Lionel or any other name. And he chose his name in Texas, Marvin Lester Brooks. Marvin, well, we don't know why. Lester was.
My grandmother's brother's name, and Brooks was her maiden name.
But we did find out that Marvin Lester Brooks. Their grandmother's name was Mary Rhodes. They were MLB. Both of their daughters were MLBs. So even by giving himself the same name, he was remembering his Tennessee past. Thank you so much.
We do have books available at the desk out in the lobby.